Hello, this is Craig Camp, and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into organic and biodynamic farming at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. Today, this is part 2 of our discussion of blending at Troon, which is the heart of our concept here with 20 varieties. Making these blends, the Ascendant blend and the Druids blends, are our largest productions. And in this segment, Micah Wagner, our assistant winemaker, and Nate Wall, our winemaker, discuss their process in making these blends. So we've been talking about our Druids wines and our Ascendant wines, which are blends. So Nate, could you tell us about your blending process and how it all happens?
Sure, yeah. So the first step of the blending trial is, of course, getting the samples that we are going to take. So getting those samples from the cellar and bringing them into, we have a conference room here in the office area that we like to use for the actual analysis. Out of the cellar, there's a lot of smells and aromas and things in the cellar. We want a more neutral area to be able to evaluate these wines. So yeah, Micah, you want to describe the sample collection and what we do with them?
Sure. So I will go into the cellar and I will take one sample out of each vessel that is a possibility in the blend. And so when I say vessel too, of course, we have a lot of barrels here, but that could sometimes be a tank, an amphora, a keg. So there are a lot of
concrete egg.
Concrete eggs. Yep. We have a lot of fun projects here, and this is also how we would perform any blending session. So, there are also times that we've maybe done a blend, and most of it is in tank, and we're kind of finalizing some details. So it might be a tank, a few barrels, and a few kegs. But when we are first tasting for our first blending session, there typically are quite a few samples to take. So we'll go through one sample per vessel, and we take them into wine glasses. We make sure there's enough that Nate and I will both be able to sample them independently. So just vessel by vessel, but then also from there we start the blending process. So we want to make sure there's enough out of each vessel where we're not running out of a blending session to go and take additional samples. We try to do that as best we can anyways.
Right, because we need enough for both of us to be able to taste each vessel independently, but then enough remaining after that so that we have enough volume to start making these different blends.
Yes, and so we'll get one sample into each glass, and we will label them in a way where we don't know what we're tasting. So I typically will have a list that maybe has a code of each barrel, and that corresponds just to a number that will maybe stick underneath each glass. And so once I pull every single sample, bring it into the conference room, and we'll make sure that the door is shut. We're trying our best to taste earlier in the morning, also hoping no one is eating food right outside in the kitchen. And also we're kind of aware that, we don't want to eat anything or drink anything within a few hours prior to doing this, just so that our palates are really on point. So I typically cut myself off from coffee personally after a certain point during the morning. And
that's why it's kind of nice to do it in the morning too, right? It's actually better to do before lunch if we can. Your palate is most primed, it's most receptive at that time of day. I think everyone's kind of familiar with that kind of post-lunch slump. You eat the food, you go into a small food coma, like everything is just depressed and in your nervous system and whatnot. And because of that, you've just had food, your body's not hungry. It's like, I don't want to pay attention to aromas and flavors, and it's like, I'm not interested in that right now. So yeah, morning time's good.
And I think, as Nate mentioned too, getting out of the cellar, away from all of the smells and everything that we're used to day to day. For me, I'm topping these barrels year round, and cleaning in there. There are a lot of projects going on, and we also have a farm here, so it's like there are a lot of other things going on the property and in the cellar where Nate and I are tasting the rest of the year and doing barrel samples, and we've seen these wines go through their whole life and evolve into what they currently are in glass in that blending session. But we want to kind of take ourselves out of that and have this different new perspective and really be like on our best game. And
yeah, that's a good point. Like, because as the wines are evolving in barrel, those samples, when we're just kind of tasting barrel by barrel in certain lots, like we know what we're tasting because we're like standing in front of the barrel. Yeah. We're tasting it in the cellar to kind of check out how these wines are evolving and finishing malolactic, for example, things like that. Those more informal but kind of progressive tastings occur in right in front of the barrels in the cellar itself. But for these blending sessions, we're trying to remove all of that and bring them in a more formal setting, I guess.
Yeah. And we talk about sometimes having a winemaker brain and kind of being very critical of the wines at times. And we need to do that in this scenario, of course, because we want the best blend possible. So we're really setting ourselves up to truly be able to taste each and every sample independently. We start off with all of those samples in their glasses, not knowing exactly what we're tasting, but we each will taste pretty much in silence to start the first round, just vessel by vessel, and coming out of each glass.
Supposed to be silent every once in a while.
Supposed to be silent. We have a little too much fun sometimes, but we try to kind of just have our own first round of notes and opinions, and then once we've tasted everything, we start chatting about it and come together and start kind of creating this blend. So
yeah, so like the actual identifier for those barrels are on the bottom of it. So if we need to know what it is, we can look up later. But then we just label them all like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or something. So we're like, oh, what did you think about barrel 5? Or like we don't know at this point yet what that is. But we have gone through each individually and poured some of that glass into our tasting glass and tasted through all those wines. Another thing we like to do is we start kind of at opposite ends. So like, if there's 20 barrels, like I'll start at 1 and you'll start at 20 and we'll work backwards, just to kind of also eliminate any potential carryover effect from the barrel you tasted to the next one. So it's possible that sometimes you might have a different perspective. If I went from, barrel 3 to 4, and it's like barrel 3 had, something going on that affected how I tasted number 4, and maybe I, didn't like it as much or something. But Micah went from barrel 5 to barrel 4, and she really liked barrel 4. That's like, hey, okay, let's, in a vacuum, let's go back to barrel 4, and we can talk about this because we had a slightly different experience of it based upon just our tasting order, quite frankly. And so, as we go through those, in this case, these 20 different samples, for example, and we have individual notes on all of them. We also pay attention to what order we tasted them in and to revisit. But
yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because there were times in all of our blending sessions, I think, where one of us would have a certain opinion, and even if it wasn't completely opposite, we would revisit certain things based on those situations. Even if you have a little residual of something in your glass maybe, and like for me, smelling and being like, is this oxidized? And if you say no, not at all, then I'm like, okay, let me revisit that. Maybe I'm just like smelling something that was in my glass previously. So it's a great method to do it in that way. And I think to kind of explain it in the easiest way possible, I'll just use 20 barrels as an example of vessels because that kind of keeps it easy. But say there were 20 barrels that we were sampling one day as a possibility of going into a blend, and this always varies. But as we've described, each of those 20 samples will be in their own glasses. We don't know what they are. We taste through them, then we start talking about them. What's pretty common is, maybe there are 14, 15 that right away both of us are pretty set on. We think that they're the best for that blend, whether it be, this is very varietal specific, or this barrel just would really enhance such and such blend that we're making today. But there might be one or two that, even if it's not that I did not like it and Nate loved it, or vice versa, there's just a little to debate there. And so that's where we start creating these blends is, okay, we agreed on 14. Let's make that blend and see how those 14 taste by themselves. And
well, often, if like in those 14, it's like of that 14 that we both are like, yeah, definitely, we probably overlap on a large percentage of that, but, just kind of objectively, but there's always like 2 or 3 that like you had in your 14 or 15 that I didn't, and some that I had in mind that you didn't. And, both of those kind of be like, okay, that probably gets us from 14 or 15 to like 17 or, right there, just revisiting those. So like, between the 2 different tasters and, and initially it's just, the 2 of us generally doing this, we'll bring in other opinions after this first round generally. But we can get a long way towards that first cut of the blend right then, right? And then as you were just starting to describe, we can actually put those, let's say it's 16 barrels out of 20. We can actually make like a master blend of those 16, and then we can try what happens adding one of each of those remaining 4 to it, or a combination of those, or
maybe there were 1 or 2 that we absolutely said no to or thought were better in a different blend. So it's a cool way to kind of compare tasting notes and start the process. Like we mentioned, we typically do this a few times because, like Nate was kind of mentioning, the first round is how we're thinking that day without looking at the calendar as well.
The BD calendar.
And so we might make a few different blends that then, he and I could disagree on, or we could be a little confused which way we should go, because quite often they're all great, but it's just which one do we choose, which one is truly best. So then that's when we start getting other opinions from Craig or Nate Winters.
Well, I guess, let's not gloss over that point. So normally we, after we've come to that first tasting point, then we'll start being, okay, I kind of jumped to this, creating this master blend, but really that's not, really we'll have like a blend, A, B, C, D, E, F. We'll try different combinations of, the majority of it, probably 60 to 70% of each of those are the same, but that 25, 30% that we keep varying, dramatically alters the effect. Like, even sometimes you flip a wine label around and you see like 2 or 3% of something in a blend. You're like, is that really doing anything? And the answer is absolutely yes. Like, it is amazing how very small amounts of the right thing can really like amplify certain aspects of that wine. And it's finding those combinations, which is the whole point of these blending sessions. Once we go through and we'll do those, A, B, C, D, E, F, G blends, kind of paying attention to what we think about those. That might be where we call it for the day, right? Like, it's like, okay, like of those, lettered blends we just made, maybe we're pretty sure that like 2 or 3 of those are the right direction. But now would be a good time to, okay, we've made progress. Our tummies are growling because we're doing this before lunch, and it's probably like 2:00 at this point, anyways. And it's like, we should probably.
This could take 2 hours. It could take 5.
Yeah, no.
You never know what you're getting into, but.
And now we get to go and check the BD calendar and see what kind of a day it was, right?
Yes.
And schedule a time to do this whole thing again, but maybe we don't have to take every single individual vessel separately. Maybe we can start with, like I said, it's probably of all of those blends, maybe 60-70% of it is the same. We could start with one blend of those already, and then keep playing with some of those other variations, and then get some other opinions.
Using the 20 barrel example too, say after a day of blending for the first round, we, have 14 or 15 that we like, and then there are 1 or 2 that we really want to go to something else, and then there are a few we're kind of playing around with. What does this combination of the final 2 or 3 taste like? What if we don't add this barrel? And once we get down to a few things that we think are really good options, we can just start our second blending session making those blends and comparing those blends. And then there might even be a third blending session where we're saying, okay, what if we break down this barrel and we put half of this barrel into this blend, or 1 keg's worth into this blend? So we kind of go through rounds. Sometimes it's easier than other times, and sometimes it's very obvious what a blend should be because everyone's on the same page. Other times people have different views, but that's kind of the fun of it.
Absolutely. And just a random aside, you've mentioned kegs a couple times, and sometimes when we're giving tours, people walk through the cellar, they see all these kegs sitting around, and they just kind of wonder, why are there kegs in this winery? And those are predominantly wine barrels that we have broken down, is the terminology we use. We can break down a 160-gallon barrel into 4 15-gallon kegs, and then use those kegs for topping, right? For topping up the rest of the barrels. So inevitably, you'll have some combination of kegs maybe you'll have 2 full 15-gallon kegs and the partial keg that you're currently using to top. Those wines are also, should be considered in terms of making those blends, because they were previously a barrel in that blend, in that lot of wine, I should say. So yeah, we do have all these other smaller vessels, and that's where the math gets complicated, right? I guess we haven't physically also mentioned how we make these blends, right? So we've got a little pipette that we suck up, like generally kind of, it depends on the size of blend you're trying to make, but in a 20 barrel example, maybe you want to suck up 2 to 3 mils for each quote barrel. So what you've done then is 60 gallons equals, we'll say 3 mils. And if you were making a 15 barrel blend of those 20 barrels at 3 mils, right? Now 3 times 15 barrels, you're going to have 45 mils of sample, which is pretty much enough for 2 people to taste it and figure out what it is. So there's a lot of math involved, is the point I'm trying to get to, because when you use, that means, well, we might use a different number just to make it easier, because if you have a 15-gallon keg, now that has to be, 60 divided, so that's a fourth, so that'd be 3/4 of a mil, which we could do. But and that's another thing, right? You're just dripping a couple drops of these things into your blend, but it totally makes a difference, and you need to accommodate for all that volume at the exact proportion that it would be in the final blend. So, that's where if you get another vessel like a concrete egg or one of the Dolia or whatever that has a strange, that's 260. We generally end up using a 60-gallon barrel as one unit. And so you just do the math based on, how much of this vessel should we add to this blend so that it's the right proportion that it would be if we blended all these vessels together.
Well, that's one of the interesting parts, isn't it? That it's such a small percentage, a tiny drop, 1% can make a huge difference in the final blend.
Absolutely, yep. And that's why Micah was, mentioning sometimes we'll get down to, it's if there's a certain barrel we're really just trying to figure out, we might try half a barrel. And so all that means, right, is instead of 3 mils, we'll add 1.5 mils of that barrel. Or maybe maybe that has to be 2 different barrels. We've done that once before, where half of this barrel and half of that barrel, and that's what made the blend work. So it's just this iterative process, right? You're kind of circling the answer, and you're spiraling inwards towards the final point, and each iteration, each circle, that spiral becomes tighter and tighter, and hopefully you finally hit the bullseye at the bottom of that spiral.
Well, that leads to an interesting question. That's a great overview of the technique, but what about the philosophy? Do you have a point you're trying to arrive at, or do you feel you're being led by the wine?
Yeah, I would say we have both a vision for what we want that blend to be from a philosophical perspective, and then we also want to let the wine lead us to that way, right? So we've mentioned before about winemaking at Troon in general is that we don't necessarily make the wines like we want to make. We make the wines that are best for this vineyard, for this site, for our region. Again, going back to our kind of more minimal intervention philosophy is really trying to take what's in the vineyard into the cellar and letting that develop to its fullest potential, whatever that is. And so it's, we're more, trying to uncover what that potential is, like in the blend. And so we're kind of like sifting through all of these available possibilities and probabilities and then trying to come up with, what is that best inevitability that wine wants to be.
Yeah, I would say I'm always looking for a combination because, of course, Nate and I have been very lucky to try a lot of wines from around the world. And so whenever you're in any blending session, you're definitely thinking about other times you've had that varietal, what it can be, what you really love about that varietal or a certain blend that, maybe a past vintage, for example, of Druid's White, Druid's Red. So you kind of have these ideas in your mind as inspiration, but also we talk about how the whole process at Troon is very unique. I mean, we're not just making the wine a certain way, making each varietal a certain way, but we're truly starting it out in the vineyard. Like Nate and I are walking with Jason personally and looking and tracking how every single block and varietal is doing throughout the year, with it in mind that is possibly and hopefully going into a certain wine or blend. And so we're kind of helping it along the way navigate how to be the best it can be for that wine or blend. And this is part of that process is, okay, did that all work out? And then also not just making the blend, but what can we do different for next year? How can we make this better? It's always, how can we make this better? But
winemakers are never satisfied.
never. But this is also a really fun process because you get to see all of your work, all of your team's work. I mean, we have amazing people here every day working in the vineyard, doing things by hand, working in our cellar, helping us with harvest and after, also during the bottling process. I mean, we have a lot of hard work and meticulous work at that, helping these grapes turn into what they want to be and what they're meant to be. But we finally, during this blending session, get to kind of step away from the cellar and really just, without knowing what's what, experience that as if we're just anybody, right? Drinking a glass of wine. And then kind of from that say, what's best out of this? So I think, yes, we've tried these wines in the cellar throughout their life and helped to create or attempt to create kind of what we have in mind for the blend. But obviously, if anything ends up not tasting exactly perfect for that blend, or maybe we say, ooh, this would be really cool in something else, this is that moment to kind of determine that.
We have this concept of where we think we're headed, but these blends, these blending trials, they're all very like non-dogmatic, right? You can't, and that's a big part of why we start with the blind tasting and stuff. That's just one more way of trying to eliminate these preconceived notions that you have formed, which you should be forming in the cellar over the months or years of the wine's aging and developing. So to really come at it with a fresh perspective each time, but then keeping that fresh perspective while still retaining the knowledge of where that wine was and has been and is coming to, just to really try to find that ultimate goal of putting together that magical combination to really allow the vineyard to best express itself in that blend.
So it's often said that winemaking is part art and part science. So blending is really a creative exercise.
Yeah, this is,
My favorite.
Yep, blending is the, right? Yeah, exactly. Blending is, I think, the most fun. That's the most fun you get to have. Because it's the least amount of moving really heavy things, which is what we do a lot. And so it's like the least amount of physical labor and the most amount of creative effort.
We are happy to share this podcast from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it by growing produce in our gardens and naturally crafting authentic wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.